The Norfolk coast is one of the most beautiful in the country, but it's also one of the most vulnerable. Over several centuries it's been at risk from the attacks by invaders arriving by sea, but it's also under threat from the sea itself. Global warming and a worldwide rise in sea levels will result in more decisions having to be made as to which parts of the coast are to be defended and which will be allowed to fall into the sea. A mere 9,000 years ago the Norfolk coast didn't exist at all. The landmass was joined still to the continent. The cliffs here at Trimingham are soft. Trees once covered this area, also what is now the North Sea. In geological terms it's part of the Cromer forest bed. Recent cliff falls are clearly visible. In the middle distance the radar scanner keeps a wary watch. Overstrand High Street comes to an abrupt stop, closed because of recent cliff falls. The village contains several elegant Edwardian houses, including two designed by Edwin Lutyens. This little village had become a popular resort by the end of the 19th century, due in part to the publicity given to the area by London journalist Clement Scott. He later regretted the hordes of visitors who flocked to see the marvellous area he called Poppyland. Too late, Mr. Scott. The Norfolk coast remains one of the most popular holiday destinations in the country. Cromer Golf Course is one of the several cliff-top courses in Norfolk. They become smaller as the sea erodes the land. Cromer Lighthouse standing high and white on the cliff top, warning sailors of the many sandbanks. There have been some dramatic sea rescues along this coast. Cromer's most famous son is Henry Blogg, coxswain of the lifeboat for 38 years until 1947. Among his many awards were the George and the British Empire medals. He remains the most highly decorated lifeboatman ever. Cromer Parish Church has the tallest tower in Norfolk. At 160 feet, it has been a significant landmark from the sea for centuries. Cromer Pier with the lifeboat station at the end. Since there's never been a harbour here, the crab boats are pulled up onto the beach. Cromer wasn't always on the coast. The lost parish of Shipton is now under the sea 3 miles out, and Church Rock, the broken remains of Shipton Church, became yet another navigational hazard. The busy coast road runs all the way to Hunstanton. Some caravans are precariously close to the eroding cliffs near East Runton Gap. It was along this stretch of beach in West Runton that one of the most exciting archaeological finds of recent years was made. Following a storm, a couple walking along the base of the cliffs discovered part of an animal skeleton. It turned out to be that of a huge elephant. It would have weighed at least 10 tons and stood 4.5 meters high at the shoulder. It dates from before the Ice Age. Part of the skeleton is on show in Norwich Castle Museum, awaiting funds for a dedicated display. Norfolk is one of the best places to find fossils because much of the county contains soils and gravels of the right age. Frequently trawlers dredge up hand axes, old bones and mammoths' teeth which would have been on sites now under the sea. And this stretch of beach is the only place where genuine rock pools exist. The flint edge pools lie in a chalk layer. This prevents creatures from being washed out with the tide. Here school parties are brought to fish for sea anemones, mollusks, small fish and seaweeds. Sheringham was a fishing village long before it became a seaside resort. Locals are called Shannocks. The word might derive from the dialect Shanny or Shaddock, meaning unruly, and probably relates to the rivalry between Cromer and Sheringham. The boats fished for crabs, lobsters and whelks, and again, as at Cromer, had to be hauled up onto the beach because there's no harbour. The Lifeboat Museum houses the Henry Ramey Upture, which saw service from 1894 to 1935. It had sails, 16 oars and a crew of 19. In bad weather there were 2 men at each oar, so the boat had a total crew of 35 before even beginning the rescue. The Coast Guard lookout building stands at the edge of the cliff, and the line of the North Norfolk Railway can just be picked out behind the golf course. You might have noticed the track of the Norfolk Coastal Path running along the cliffs all the way from Cromer. It's part of the trail which joins the Peddar's Way at Hunstanton to become a national trail of 93 miles ending at Nettishall in Suffolk. The Peddar's Way is an ancient route, but the Norfolk Coast Path has been created to give marvellous on-foot access to this most beautiful heritage coast. Weybourne Mill in the background, and here the soft crumbling cliffs peter out and an entirely different landscape begins. From here westwards to home, the entire 22 miles is a designated site of special scientific interest, an internationally important wetland which has EEC protection for wild birds. The cluster of buildings mid-picture houses the Muckleburgh collection of army tanks and military vehicles. It's named after Muckleburgh Hill. Immediately behind it stands on the site of the old army camp of Weybourne. There were firing ranges here during World War II, and during World War I, troops embarked for France at this point. An old saying goes, "He who would England win must first at Weybourne hope begin." This is because the beach shelves steeply into deep water, which would enable deep draft enemy boats to anchor close to the shore. This has led to a succession of invasion scares, and Queen Elizabeth I made elaborate defence preparations here against the threat of the Spanish invasion. Salthouse got its name from the warehouse used to store salt from the salt marshes. Salt fish was an important part of the economy for the fishing ports along this part of the coast, and in the Middle Ages ships voyaged as far as Iceland for cod and ling. Salthouse was once a port, but has been landlocked since 1638. The marsh has been badly flooded after every rage. A rage is the local term for a tidal surge. There have been several banks created to keep out the sea over the centuries, and at present there's a plan for a clay bank across the middle of the marshes. Salt marshes and the mudflats in front of them are said to be the only natural wilderness areas left in Britain. Cly in the distance. The spit which ends at Blakely Point is beginning to form. Over several hundred years the spit has changed shape and grown in length. Cly or Clay, both pronunciations are heard today, was one of the Glaven ports. In the Middle Ages it was part of a wide estuary and a natural harbour sheltered by the western end of Blakely Point. The Coast Guard look out at Cly Eye. An eye was Old English for a small island among the Saltings. Now it's almost washed away. Twitchers, bird watchers, flock to Cly in their thousands. Blakeney in the distance. We shall get a closer look in a moment. The following words are taken from a pilot guide to the east coast. Blakeney Harbour should be entered with great caution from seawards and only under suitable conditions of sea, tide and visibility. Visitors are strongly advised to arrange with the assistance of the pilot, and if further caution was needed, there are many wrecks on the chart. This is the last port between Great Yarmouth and Wells. Blakeney Point is in the care of the National Trust. It's an important bird sanctuary and has colonies of breeding terns and grey and common seals. Brent geese, ducks and waders spend winters here. Rare migrants pass through in spring and autumn. Access is by foot along the shingle from Cley, a 6-mile return walk, or by boat from Blakeney or Morstan in the season. Within 1,000 years the point has doubled in length and is building up westwards in the process known as longshore drift. The sea surge of 1953 reduced its length, and even today it's constantly reforming. In geological terms, spits are very temporary. Here is the entrance to Blakeney Harbour. Blakeney with Morstan Harbour in the background. Agar Creek, which connects Morstan to Blakeney, shows as a thin line on the landward edge of the marshes. Samphire, one of the first plants to colonise a salt marsh, grows here in abundance. It's a delicacy available in season in local fishmongers and eaten boiled, sprinkled with vinegar. The channel from Blakeney Harbour to the sea is a thin winding ribbon mid-pitcher. There's a National Trust observation tower on Morstan Quay with views stretching to the old lifeboat station on Blakeney Point. This coast from Weyburn to home contains 24 county wildlife sites and 8 nature reserves in an unbroken chain. There's a bid to designate the area as a World Heritage Site. Already it has an area of outstanding natural beauty status. The mouth of the river Stiffkey and Stiffkey marshes, the oldest salt marshes along the coast, and once the habitat of stooky blue cockles collected by the women of the village at low tide, but cockle numbers dwindled in the 1950s. Stooky blues were mentioned in the 17th century writings as Thomas Brown. Each July the marshes are covered with purple sea lavender. Stooky means island of stumps, a reminder of the time when this whole area was a forest. Probably the best known inhabitant of Stiffkey was the Reverend Harold Davidson, but we'll hear more about him on the return flight. In Stiffkey Main Street there's a blue plaque to writer Henry Williamson, creator of Tarka the Otter. There was an army camp at Stiffkey in 1939. Targets were towed by aircraft for artillery practice. The targets were made of bright red material, which afterwards appeared locally as fishermen's slops and a variety of ladies' clothing. Stonemeal Creek meanders towards Wells, seen in the distance, with Warham salt marshes to its right. Canoeists venture along these shallow, isolated waters, which are part of a national nature reserve. The entrance to Wells Harbour is tricky. There are sandbars at the entrance and the state of the tide is critical. In the foreground, the wooded area is known as East Hills, but hill is a slight exaggeration here. On the far side of the harbour entrance are the pines of Holcombe Meals, with the wide sweep of Holcombe Bay beyond. The navigation channel has to be dredged regularly, and boats can enter the port only at certain states of the tide. The film so far has been shot from a relatively low level height of about 700 feet and at high tide. The same area looks different from a height of 4,000 feet and at low tide. At low tide it becomes obviously why a pilot is needed to guide deeper draft boats along its narrow channel to Wells Quay. To make this task more difficult, the sands are often on the move and there's a sandbar in the harbour entrance. The wave pattern across the damp sands makes a surreal landscape. The closing scenes of the film Shakespeare in Love were shot here in Holcombe Bay in 1998. Gwyneth Paltrow as Lady Viola de Lesseps is seen walking across a wide sweep of beach which is supposed to be Bermuda. It was in fact here at Holcombe. The harbour channel or run is the deep blue line mid-picture. The pines, mainly Corsican but also Scots pine, maritime and Monterey pines, were planted in 1860 to stabilise the sand dunes and protect the reclaimed land behind them from erosion. It was one of the first experiments of stabilisation and was pioneered by the second Earl of Leicester, better known as Cook of Norfolk, a great agricultural reformer. The Coast Guard lookout station and lifeboat shed with its bright red roof. The RNLI has had a lifeboat at Wells since 1830, and before that the Norfolk Shipwreck Association went to the help of boats in trouble. The boating lake, known as Abraham's Bosom, was originally part of the harbour and provided a safe haven for fishing boats. The seawall was built by the second Earl of Leicester in 1859 in order to reclaim the land behind. It's been raised and strengthened several times and now there are plans to do it again. A miniature railway runs alongside the road. Close to the harbour master's office at the end of Beach Road, there's a touching monument for the crew of Eliza Adams, the RNLI's first Wells lifeboat, who in 1880 were drowned when their mast broke and the boat foundered. Some were trapped in the rigging and some tried to swim ashore. Of the 12 crew on board, 10 were lost. Over the years, Wells has suffered badly from inundation by the sea, especially in 1953, as the flood level markers on quayside buildings show. There's a flood monitoring station in the lifeboat house. In 1978, gales lifted a coaster right out of the water and dumped it onto the quay. Wells port began to decline when the Wells to Fakenham Railway opened in 1857. In 1800, a large number of pilots were on the payroll because the harbour was so busy. Trade dropped off gradually, but some boats still brought in fertiliser and coal for another 150 years. Commercial boats no longer visit, but fishing boats bring in the largest catches of whelks in the UK. In 2002, visitors came flocking to Wells to see the Dutch-registered sailing coaster Albatross aground in the harbour channel. Local attempts to pull her off at high tide failed, but eventually a Dutch salvage boat managed to refloat her. She's in Wells Harbour today whenever she's not on a charter. Wells has many different associations with the sea. For example, in the churchyard lies the local man John Fryer, the original master of the Bounty. That's of mutiny and Captain Bligh fame. And 7 boats left for Dunkirk from Wells, along with 1 from Brancaster, 1 from Blakeney, and some Sheringham fishermen. Wells is the base for the new Norfolk Coast project, which is dedicated to keeping the North Norfolk coast special. The project is a partnership between the County Council, the local and parish councils, the relevant government and conservation bodies, landowners, and all organisations with concerns in the area. The aim is to make everyone aware of the need to look after and appreciate this unique landscape. A small bay is marked on the map as a boating lake. The groins break the force of the sea and slow down sand drift. The bay turns inland at Holcombe Gap, and the tree-lined Lady Anne's Road leads to the A149 road and to Holcombe Hall. There are paths, some on boardwalks, through the pines which house a resident breeding population of crossbills, and there's a reed fringe pole often frequented by little grebes and a scrape with a hide for the observation of wading birds. The Holcombe National Nature Reserve extends for several thousand acres. The margin of land between the shore and the main coast road contains a network of drainage dykes. The arable land of the Holcombe estate begins to the north of the main road. The foreground was once salt marsh, and there was a creek along which boats worked to reach a staith at Holcombe. Difficult to imagine now. Overy Creek leading to the village of Burnham Overy Staithe. The word staithe comes from the Old English for a landing place. Schooners, large barges and brigantines came up here to trade. The sand dunes at Gun Hill in the foreground support a colony of nesting terns. In the creek inshore there are mussel beds where the embryo mussels called seeds are planted, having been brought round from the wash. It's confusing for sailors because there are buoys marking the channels and buoys marking the mussel beds. The eastern tip of Scalt Head Island with Gun Hill on the left. This is the most researched part of the whole Norfolk coast. It has been a reserve since 1923, and its 1,620 acres are managed jointly with the National Trust and the Norfolk Wildlife Trust. The island is extending westward due to the sea movement on the shingle. Sandwich turns as summer visitors, while winter residents include Brent geese, widgeon and the pink-footed goose. Oyster catchers, ducks, snipe and redshank are present year-round. Brancaster can be seen in the background. Scalt is an alternate name for a skull, and Scalt Head Island, with its small bumps and winding channels, were thought to resemble an infestation of ringworm on the head. Certain villages living in Brancaster, Staithe, Burnham Deepdale and Burnham Overy Staithe have common rights on Scalt Head. Banded together into an association and registered as members, they have the right to graze sheep, cattle, horses and geese, pick samphire and sea lavender, to fish and collect, among other vegetation, wood, reeds and seaweed. Where Scalt Island End is in line with Branadunum, the Roman town which lies on the main road between Brancaster Staithe and Brancaster. There's nothing left now except an interpretation board and a field with a few raised mounds, but in the 4th century AD this was a coastal garrison fort. Roman soldiers embarked here for their journeys home. The channel leading to Brancaster Harbour. Brancaster Golf Course is sandwiched between the shoreline and Brancaster Marshes. The granite gateposts onto the course serves as an unusual war memorial. The names carved there are seen and remembered rather more often than some of those in more traditional positions. The track down to the clubhouse leads also to a car park with access to the beach. In winter the shoreline is frequented by snow buntings. The embankment is at the start of the RSPB's Titchwell Reserve. This land was claimed from the sea in the 1790s, but the tide surge of 1953 destroyed the sea wall and it's reverted to marsh. It's one of the best of all-season bird watching sites, and the RSPB has created new habitats with tidal and freshwater reed beds, saltwater and freshwater marshes. Watch particularly in summer for the avocet. The visitor centre is open daily year-round. The site has hides overlooking the lagoons and there are benches for resting along the paths. Thornham used to be a busy port, bringing in coal and exporting grain, but, as elsewhere, the railway stole the trade. The Jessie Mary was the last ship to use the port in 1914, and the floods of 1953 swept away the last granary. North-facing Thornham is situated just before the coast begins its gradual turn to the west. Locals boast that there is no land between them and the North Pole. The boat leaving the harbour has on its port side the Home Dunes Nature Reserve, and on the skyline it's possible to pick out the curve of the coast. On home dunes, the Norfolk Ornithologist Trust cares for a bird observatory within the National Trust area. It's a varied area of sand dunes and mud flats, salt marshes, fresh water and brackish pools and grazing marshes. The pines were planted a century ago to stabilise the dunes. During World War II, it was used as an artillery range, but now it's a mecca for spring and autumn migrants as well as for bird watchers. When spring tide divert them from the wash, the area contains large flocks of waders. The aircraft is turning over Gore Point and changing heading from west to southwest towards Hunstanton. The white tower of the lighthouse can be seen on the skyline. Hunstanton Golf Course leading on to Old Hunstanton, which was originally a fishing village. The Lestrange family of Hunstanton Hall were responsible for creating New Hunstanton as a resort 150 years ago. The Lestrange hereditary title was Lord High Admiral of the Wash. Their estates ran, I quote, beyond the tide line and as far as a man can ride on horseback and throw a javelin. New Hunstanton was given the seal of approval when Queen Victoria's son Edward, Prince of Wales, came here to convalesce from typhoid. The pitch and putt course separates the old town from New Hunstanton, known also as Hunston. At St Edmund's Point, the cliffs with their distinctive layers of chalk, red limestone and yellow carstone begin. The chalk layer is the end of a seam which runs all the way from the Chilterns. Fossil can be found in the cliffs and on the seashore. The Coast Guard lookout and the lighthouse, which was built near the ruins of St Edmund's Chapel, was once known to the seamen as the Chapel Light. Ornamental gardens lead towards a stub of what was left of the pier after a storm 30 years ago. Since this film was shot, the stub also has been burned down and a new build is under construction. The wide space is now a car park, previously the site of the railway station. The Amusements and Sea Life Centre lead towards the caravan holiday camps of Sunny Honey. Although Hunstanton is part of eastern England, the town faces west onto the Wash. The aircraft was turning to fly back along the coast, but slightly inland to give a different perspective. The chalk seam of the cliffs is present also on the land. Just inland are Ringsted Downs, a rare example of chalk grassland. The chalk was deposited during one of the ice ages of prehistory. The lighthouse, one of the earliest on the east coast, warned sailors of the ever-present hazard of the many sandbanks present in the Wash. Seal Island is one such sandbank, and in summer, trip boats go out from Hunstanton to see the seal colonies basking there. On a clear day, the coast of Lincolnshire stands out well. Old Hunstanton on the coast and the parkland of Hunstanton Hall underneath the aircraft. The flight has become noticeably bumpier since the aircraft turned inland. Air over the land is adversely affected by temperature changes, causing turbulence. Home next to sea. In 1999, a circle of 55 timber posts appeared on the beach within the intertidal zone. Some local people claim to have known of the post's existence for the previous 10 years. Nicknamed Sea Henge, the circle is thought to be about 4,000 years old and possibly has some religious or ritual significance. The experts at Flag Fen Peterborough are currently examining the timbers. At the time the circle was created, the sand it stands in was inland. Tree stumps of prehistoric forests have been found both off the coast here at home and at neighbouring Thornham. Village history often is portrayed in the village sign, so it is with Thornham. In 1880, the lady of the manor wanted a project for the villagers and an ironworks was set up. So successful was it that among other commissions, gates were made for Sandringham House and work was shown at the 1900 parish exhibition. But the works closed at the end of World War I, and the Thornham sign, standing in the middle of the village, showing ironworkers in their forge, is the only reminder that it once existed. The ironworkers' cottages had been converted to holiday homes. Thornham was once a busy port bringing in coal and exporting grain. Shallow draft boats came along here in the Middle Ages. In the 17th century, the marshes were drained for grazing. During World War II, Titchwell's marshes were used as a tank firing range. In 1978, the RSPB acquired them and created the reserve. The group of 6 parishes comprises Titchwell, Thornham, Home, Old Hunstanton, Brancaster and Burnham Deepdale are called the Saxon Shore Benefice. The Saxons invaded and settled much of the eastern coast. There was a church at Titchwell by the time Domesday Book was written. An 11th century font was discovered in a Titchwell field a couple of hundred years ago. It was being used as a drinking trough. Brancaster was Scolthead in the background. The word Castor indicates Roman origin, just like the 2 Norfolk cases near Norwich and Great Yarmouth. Branadunum was the 4th century a shore fort under the command of the grand-sounding Count of the Saxon Shore. It was built to protect the hinterland from invasion. From landwards, the creeks and marsh embankments are easier to see. The site of Branadunum is the large square green field at the end of the village. Its walls were 11 feet thick, but 17th century stone robbing has removed all traces of the buildings. Brancaster Staithe, formerly the commercial centre of the village. Here there used to be one of the largest malt houses in the country. Dial House, now National Trust Activity Centre, was once the Custom House. A sailor's paradise today, there is a local bylaw stating vessels must muffle their rigging, as everyone who has stood near tied-up sailing boats on a windy day will appreciate. Clinker-built dinghies still work the cockle beds, and a ferry service runs out to Scolt Head. The hamlet of Burnham Deepdale is at the curve of the sea wall. There are 7 Burnhams in all. Burnham Thorpe, 4 miles inland, was the birthplace of Horatio Nelson. His father was rector there. Deepdale and Norton Marshes. Trolland Creek and Norton Creek run through Overy Marsh and lead round to Burnham Overy Staithe. On the horizon, the eastern end of the Scolthead Island, with Gun Hill on the opposite sandbank. The mouth of the River Burn is here at Burnham Overy Staithe, which used to be yet another busy port. The harbour entrance channels change frequently with the winds and tides. The one-time captain of the Cutty Sark, the sailing boat, which was the last of the tea clippers, lived here. Ironically, it was the build-up of the estuaries and the silting up and loss of the ports which has given us the wilderness landscape we treasure today. The pines of Holcombe Meads in the background with the wide expanse of Holcombe Bay beyond. This land was reclaimed from the sea by the Earl of Leicester from 1659 onwards, but it was his great-nephew Thomas Cook, or Cook of Norfolk, the second Earl, who planted the pines and earned the reputation of a great agricultural reformer and the father of modern farming. On his farms he improved the breed of livestock and put into practice the four-course crop rotation system invented by his neighbour Viscount Townshend of Rainham Hall, nicknamed Turnip Townshend. Cook's influence on modern farming cannot be overestimated. The lake in Holcombe Park probably was connected to a tidal creek. The first Earl began building Holcombe Hall in 1734, and it took 28 years to complete. In the Palladian style and designed by William Kent, the detailing was left to the Norwich architect Matthew Brettenham. The Grand Parkland was designed by Capability Brown, whose Christian name actually was Lancelot, but on being asked about whatever grand project he was working upon at that moment, would reply that it had capabilities, meaning potential. On the skyline is the entrance to Wells Harbour. The salt marshes on the other side of the harbour pole show what the land on the Holcombe side would look like if it had been reclaimed. Although the coming of the railway killed off the trade into the port of Wells, there is still a railway here. It's narrow gauge and runs the 4 miles from Wells to Walsingham in the summer. Stonemill Creek winds through Warham salt marshes until it reaches Stiff Key Marshes Nature Reserve. The coast path leaves Wells Quay, crosses a footbridge and follows the green line of vegetation around the edge of the marsh all the way to Morstan, where it has to make a slight detour. Although the landscape looks empty, there's evidence of continuous occupation just inland, both an Iron Age fort and ruins of a Tudor manor house at Warham, a castle inland of Wells, the remains of a priory at Binham, and entrenchments at Warborough Hill. All these help to provide evidence of earlier activity. Warborough Hill may have been one of the series of Roman signalling stations linked with Brancaster. The green line running down to the marsh is picturesquely called Cocklestrand Drove. A strand is a beach, and a drove an ancient route down which animals were driven. Warborough Hill stands just off the main coast road on a 30-metre contour. It is described as an entrenchment. It certainly has a good defensive position with views out to sea, along the coast in both directions and inland. The River Stiffkey down below, and the aircraft will fly right overhead the village. Stiffkey is well remembered for its rector, the Reverend Harold Davidson, who spent the majority of his time in London rescuing, in his words, the fallen girls of Soho, then bringing them back to Norfolk. He was tried, found guilty of immorality, and defrocked at a service in Norwich Cathedral on October the 21st, 1932. He was ordered to pay costs and spent the rest of his life proclaiming his innocence and attempted to raise funds for an appeal by preaching from a barrel inside a lion's cage at circuses in Blackpool and Skegness. He reasoned if he was innocent, the lion would not hurt him. Unfortunately, innocent or not, in 1938 the lion mauled him to death. The trial has been the scandal of 1932, and journalists from the London newspapers chartered an aircraft which landed on Blakely Point so that they could visit Stiffkey. The mound of Garrett Hill, possibly another early fortification. The village of Morstan with Blakely Point on the skyline. The marshes are part of what would have been the harbour approach for the Glaven ports of Blakely, Cley and Wiverton. Blakely boats were at the siege of Calais, and when the Spanish Armada threatened, 36 boats were sent from the three ports. There's a galleon in full sail on Blakely's village sign. The history of Blakely, and also that of Cley and Wiverton, centres around fishing, trading, smuggling, the embankment of the marshes, the silting up of the harbours, and now small boats and tourism. As early as the Middle Ages, ships were sailing from the Glaven port as far as Iceland. There had been early trade with the Low Countries and the Baltic too. The Guildhall dates from the 14th century. The village is now highly desirable to second homeowners, but the Blakely Housing Society provides affordable housing for local people. Blue plaque marks the society's cottages. The church, dedicated to St Nicholas, patron saint of fishing, has a second smaller tower at eastern end where a beacon was kept lit to aid ships entering the harbour. The River Glaven flows through the valley and past Cley Mill. The aircraft is directly overhead the small village of Wiverton. Cley's 18th century windmill was grinding flour until the end of World War I. To find the part of the beach, start at the mill. After a fire in 1612, when most houses were destroyed, the village moved to its present position, leaving the church inland with a few houses at its foot, marking the site of medieval Cley. White's Directory of 1845 lists a fortnightly packet boat service to Hull and London. When embankments were built across the marshes for land reclamation and flood prevention, effectively Cley was cut off from the sea except for a long channel which silts up, especially when there's a tidal surge. From Cley to Salthouse is a string of marshes, now nature reserves, with scrape pools for wading birds and summer visitors including spoonbills. The bittern, once threatened with extinction, is making a comeback here. Bearded tits feed on the reed seeds. This area is accessible only on foot and has been called the most famous bird walk in Britain, so numerous are the species to be seen. It is designated a special area of conservation. Salthouse Church, subject of numerous watercolours, particularly the view of it from the main road with the sea beyond. Like Blakeney, it is dedicated to St Nicholas and was built in the reign of Henry VII. Along this stretch of coastline is Celyn Hard. There was a telegraph station here linking the continent with London. In 1858, an undersea cable from Borkum on the Frisian Islands was brought ashore at this point, and it went via Norwich and Newmarket to London, and in 1950 a cable link with Denmark was created. Muckleborough Hill and Weybourne is where the shingle ends and the cliffs start again. The track past Weybourne Mill to the cottages joins with the Norfolk Coast Path. The coast track used to run on the seaward side of the cottages, but had to be diverted inland because of coastal erosion. Throughout this film, the sea has been a major player, sometimes a threat, sometimes an enhancement, but always a factor to be reckoned with, and one which has made this coast among the most special in the world.